It's been over a year since Final Fantasy VII Rebirth launched on PlayStation 5, and since it's the second part of a trilogy of games, fans are eagerly anticipating the third and final entry in the series. After watching the end of Rebirth, you probably have some questions, and having to wait for the final part to find out all of the answers can feel like agony. Last year, Motomo Toriyama said in a Famitsu interview in regards to the second anniversary of Ever Crisis, by then, we may have started to release information about the last part of the FF7 Remake project, so I hope that players will get excited about that with us. So the second anniversary of Ever Crisis event did in fact happen, and all we got was this from Tetsuya Nomura. We have decided on the timing of when we will make an announcement. The game is making great progress. So Toriyama really got ahead of himself last year. So many fans then speculated, well, they must mean that they're going to show it at Tokyo Game Show then. And that didn't happen either. Nor did it get announced ahead at Sony's State of Play. So, when will we find out about it? When will it be released? Well, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade is releasing on January 22nd, 2026, and we might be able to surmise a release window for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. I really hate saying that every time. Can I just call it Final Fantasy VII ReThird? That's easier to say. I'm just gonna call it that from now on. Anyways, Naoki Hamaguchi did a ton of interviews recently surrounding the Tokyo Game Show about Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade being ported to multiple platforms, and there's some interesting information. We're going to talk about that, game key cards, PlayStation 6, and how all of that relates to the future of the Final Fantasy VII ReTrilogy, including ReThird, when it could release, and even what might be coming after ReThird. The question is, should we be excited for Final Fantasy VII ReThird, or worried? Well, that's what we're here to talk about. So many people have already gotten their hands on playing Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade on Switch 2, and the reception has been pretty positive. It seems like it's basically the Intergrade version of the game on PS5, with most of the lighting effects retained, but unlike the PS5 or PC version, can't run in 60 FPS. It will be locked to only 30 FPS, and most people have said that it's fairly stable at that frame rate. Of course, there are plenty of other channels you can watch for further analysis of the tech, and I suspect there will be more when it releases. But it's essentially the PS5 version, but in 30 FPS with the Yuffie DLC Intermission packaged in. But that's not all. It will also have some new features that aren't present in the current versions of the game. There will be new streamlined progression settings. These include cheats such as constant max HP, ATB gauge always full, 2x EXP and 3x AP gain, and a ton more. Naoki Hamaguchi was asked why this is being implemented into these ports of the game, and he had this to say from an Automaton interview. As I mentioned earlier, nothing makes us happier as creators than seeing more people get the chance to play our games. Of course, many players will want to experience the trilogy as a full RPG and play through everything on their own, but I think there are also plenty of people who just want to experience the story, yet feel that starting all the way from the first game is a daunting task. I feel the same way myself. There are lots of games I want to try for reference, and while I do play them, I often don't have enough time to get through them. I sometimes catch myself thinking, if only I had debug features, I could see more. So, it's essentially about getting new players to be able to catch up to the third game faster whenever that releases. So the question is, how fast can you go if you enable these settings, in addition to the ability to speed up cutscenes, which was updated to current versions of the game a while back? Well, he talks about that in this exchange from the Automaton interview. If you combine streamlined progression with cutscene fast forward, how long would a full playthrough take? Probably under 10 hours. I think you could get through it in around 7 or 8. Normally it takes 40 to 50 hours to finish, right? That's a huge difference. Honestly, I'd say I'm among the directors who replay their games the most during development. By hand, right? Of course. But even then, I try to play efficiently. Depending on the focus, whether I'm checking overall flow, balance, or battles, I use debug-like tools to adjust things, like maxing out damage. The streamlined progression options basically bring that environment to regular players. I think that's a very modern approach to game design. So you might be wondering if they'll bring this feature to the PlayStation 5 and PC versions of the game. Well, Hamaguchi responded to this exact question in the Den Feminico Gamer interview. It's a great question. At this point, I can't give a definitive answer, but we are considering it. He then went on to explain other updates that could be coming though. Personally, since we're delivering the trilogy across multiple platforms, I want to make sure we're providing the same experience no matter where you play. For example, when we released the PC version of FF7 Rebirth, we rolled out an update that improved lighting quality. Fans then asked, please bring this to the PS5 version as well. We finally made some progress there and are preparing to roll it out at some point. That said, the team is currently focused on developing the third and final entry, and with limited resources and prioritization, I can't promise a specific time frame right now, but we do want everyone to have the same experience across platforms, so I hope fans can be patient with us a little longer. So it looks like we might be getting some Rebirth updates soon, which we'll talk a bit more about Rebirth in a minute, but first, we need to discuss some of the issues surrounding this port of Intergrade, and specifically the port to the Switch 2. On PlayStation 5, the combined space that both the base game and the intermission DLC take up is around 90 gigabytes of data. Now, you would think that they would have tried to compress file sizes down for this release, since the Switch 2 only has 256 gigabytes of internal storage. Nope. It's going to take up 90 gigabytes, which is the same amount of space. That's literally about 1/3 of the Switch 2's internal storage capacity from just this game. Now, my guess is it's pretty hard for them to compress the data down much, given the game often relies on pre-rendered cutscenes that you probably don't even notice as you're watching cutscenes. Anytime the game switches to some kind of flashback or quickly cuts to a different location, even if it looks like it's a cutscene rendered in-engine, it was likely pre-recorded as a video file so that they don't have to load up a different scene, interrupting the flow of the cutscene. Otherwise, the game would have to take the time to load all the assets before transitioning to said moment, which would look kind of like this.
So, you know Tifa, right? It's not really my business, but are you guys close?
The upside to pre-rendered cutscenes is that they don't take much processing power, hence making it quick to load, but they consume a large amount of memory, which is how the game ends up taking up almost 100 gigabytes of data. So the other controversial problem with the amount of storage space it occupies is that it's going to be released as a game key card, which fans really hate, and for good reason. You get a physical case with a physical cartridge inside, only to find out that the data for the game isn't actually on the cartridge. The cartridge only contains a code for you to download the game from the eShop, so you don't really own the game or its data. It's almost no different than purchasing the game digitally. The only difference is you can display the case on your shelf, I guess? But from what I've heard, there is no cartridge that Nintendo offers that goes beyond 64 gigabytes, and since Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade is going beyond that, the only way that they could make it a real physical release is if they either split it into 2 cartridges, or release one cartridge that contains half the game and a code that you can use to download the rest of the game to the Switch 2's internal storage. Except that's not what they're choosing to do. So then you might think, is it because of cost? Well, no. Not exactly. Here's what Hamaguchi had to say about the matter. As has already been announced, the physical edition doesn't use traditional game cards, it uses key cards. And the reason is simple. The read speeds are dramatically faster. For cutting-edge titles like ours, when we tested on game cards, the loading times just weren't acceptable. The key card format was essential to making this version possible. Nintendo offering that option was a huge help, and it's not just for FF7 Remake, it opens the door for other advanced console games to make their way to the Switch 2 as well. Speaking as both a developer and a gamer, I'm really excited about that. So many people have speculated that the reason developers keep choosing these game key cards instead of physical ones is because of cost. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case here, and this also matches up with what a developer on Star Wars Outlaws said as well. So it seems like, unfortunately, the cartridges or the tech used to read the cartridges for Switch 2 just simply aren't up to par with the read speeds of the internal storage. So that explains why even cheaper games like Bravely Default Remaster also uses the game key card instead of a physical cartridge, despite the game not needing cutting-edge technology to run the game. The performance running games off the cartridge just simply isn't the same as running it digitally anymore. So then you might ask yourself, well then why doesn't Nintendo just simply allow the user to install the game from the cartridge directly, like PlayStation and Xbox do? Great question. And honestly, I don't know the answer. If I had to guess, I would say maybe it's because cartridges are less secure than discs, and we all know how anal Nintendo is about people pirating their software, so I'm guessing they're worried about some kind of security risk when allowing people to install games from the cartridge. But otherwise, I don't know. Maybe Nintendo is just incompetent, but I kinda doubt that. They have some reason, but good luck trying to get an answer from them directly. So no real physical version will be available for Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade on Switch 2, unfortunately. But what's even more concerning is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Now, the good news is that, yes, Hamaguchi has confirmed that not just 7 Remake, but all of the ReTrilogy will be coming to as many platforms as possible. Our goal is to bring the entire Final Fantasy VII Remake series, including the third and final entry, to multiple platforms. We wanted to keep building momentum and reach as many players as possible, and that's what led to this announcement. And that includes Rebirth on Switch 2. When the trilogy's multi-platform expansion was announced, my first thought was, so Rebirth is coming to Switch 2 and Xbox next. Can we consider that confirmed? Yes, absolutely. Development is already underway. Having played Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I have to wonder, can something of that scale really run on Switch 2? Of course, some degree of optimization will be necessary, but development is progressing smoothly, and I'm confident it will be an experience players can fully enjoy. This shouldn't be too surprising considering Rebirth can run on a Steam Deck, but the real concern is, again, the sheer size of the game. On PlayStation 5, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth takes up 145.25 gigabytes, and considering that the Switch 2 version of Intergrade didn't consume any less than the PS5 version, I'm going to guess that Rebirth on Switch 2 will also consume about 145 gigabytes of data.
Bro.
That's more than half of the Switch 2's internal storage. And considering the fact that Intergrade is using a game key card, I'm 99% sure Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will as well. In fact, Rebirth is going to desperately need the faster loading since the game was built from the ground up to use the SSD on the PlayStation 5. The only way it won't use a game key card is if Nintendo offers some kind of gigantic cartridge that can store 150 gigabytes or more and has faster read speeds comparable to its internal storage. Otherwise, expect that when you decide to play Rebirth on your Switch 2, that it's essentially going to only be one of a few games installed to your system. And while you're at it, do me a favor and install my channel to your YouTube subscriptions list by clicking the subscribe button. I talk about Final Fantasy and other JRPG content here on this channel, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on my future content. Now that we're talking about consoles and platforms, it might be worth mentioning I know, it feels too soon. You still feel like you haven't gotten your use out of the PlayStation 5 yet, but it has been 5 years now since the PS5 released, and we've already started to get leaks of the PlayStation 6 from user Moore's Law is Dead, who is a fairly credible leaker that had a copyright strike from Sony in the past over his leaks of the PlayStation 5 Pro. So these leaks are probably legit, and it seems like this is releasing either in 2027 or 2028 would be my guess. So now the question is, will Final Fantasy VII ReThird be for the PlayStation 5 or the PlayStation 6? Well, a while back Kitase was asked about this very question, and he laughed, saying, "No, you can rest assured about the next one." This was before we knew about the leaks, however. Depending on when the PlayStation 6 releases, and depending on when Final Fantasy VII ReThird releases, it may very well be a PlayStation 6 title. When do I think ReThird will release? Well, we're getting to that. But before that, we need to address the concern as to whether Final Fantasy VII ReThird will be a lesser game than 7 Rebirth, considering the sales for Rebirth have been lower than expected. However, Hamaguchi had this to say. With FF7 Rebirth, the second entry, we feel a solid sense of traction both on PS5 and on PC. Some users may be worried, but rest assured that the third installment will be delivered with the same care and quality. So in other words, they're not too concerned about the sales of the games and will continue to make the third game just as big, if not even bigger, than the prior games. So sales shouldn't be much of a concern, but what about all this multi-platform support? Is that delaying the next big project? Well, Hamaguchi answered that as well. With the third game now confirmed for multi-platform release, has that affected your original plans or concepts? Not at all. Our core development environment is built around high-spec hardware, so most of the staff don't need to worry about multi-platform multi-platform considerations. Separately, we've established a dedicated team focused on multi-platform support. They handle tasks like data customization in parallel with the main team, keeping that work cleanly divided. When the multi-platform announcement was made, I saw some concerns that development might be delayed or that quality might drop, but that won't be the case. Regardless of platform, we're committed to delivering the third game at the level we've always aimed for. So in other words, there's a separate team working on porting and optimizing the game for different platforms, so it shouldn't interfere with progress on Final Fantasy VII ReThird. However, whether Final Fantasy VII ReThird launches on multiple platforms simultaneously or not is still to be determined, as confirmed by Hamaguchi. And is simultaneous launch on all systems for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 something you're aiming for? We currently can't state exactly how it will be released. I do wish to have as many players for Switch, Xbox, and PC included be able to play the game on their desired platform, so we're going to be striving to make that happen in the best way possible. So Toriyama said he hoped there would be updates on ReThird by the second anniversary of Ever Crisis, and that didn't happen. The Tokyo Game Show didn't reveal anything new about Final Fantasy VII ReThird, but the developers have expressed in the past that since they finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in 3 years, that they should be able to finish the next game in 3 years. So, should Final Fantasy VII ReThird release by 2027 then? Well, here's what Hamaguchi said about its development. Development is going very well. We're at a stage where lots of content is playable, the direction and shape of the game are firmly in place, and the whole team is focused on building it out. So, this really doesn't tell us much. Some content being playable is pretty much what I would expect at this stage of development. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think it will release in 2027. When the devs said that it took 3 years to develop Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that's not quite true. That's the time it took since the intermission DLC, so it took them about 3 years to do this scenario maybe, but the overall game was reported as being in development as far back as 2019, before Final Fantasy VII Remake had even come out. In fact, we know that they began development on the second game to some extent, because we can see some assets were already created for the town of Nibelheim, as demonstrated in this flashback sequence. So in actuality, it took them really about 5 years to create Rebirth. So you might be thinking, well yeah, but so much of the world and assets are already complete, and most of Part 3 is retraversing back to many of the same areas as Rebirth. And that's also true, but there's so much that still needs to be created. Don't forget that they didn't cover Rocket Town in Rebirth, so they still need to create that. Wutai is also being saved for ReThird, and we know from both of the prior games how much they've been teasing how big of a role that's going to play in the final game, so I suspect that will be much bigger than it ever was in the original. Not to mention Mideel, which if they manage to expand Gongaga as much as they did, I can't wait to see how expansive Mideel is, especially considering how significant it actually is to the plot of the final game. Then there's new sections we'll be exploring in Junon, bitch slapping Scarlet on top of the sister Ray, pretty much the entirety of the northern continent, although it did look like they completed a good portion of the City of the Ancients already, as indicated by the map in the final chapter of Rebirth. Then there's the underwater sections, which could be a whole other world to explore with the submarine in and of itself, as well as airship traversal, which they've already said was going to blow us away, and then there's all these fucking massive weapons that they need to make, not to mention the final dungeon, the crater. Need I remind you that Remake's final dungeon was 2 to 3 hours long. Rebirth's final dungeon was like 5 hours long. Bro, expect ReThird's final dungeon to take like 8 hours, not including the 2-hour final boss segment against Sephiroth, and then expect to be able to pull out some fucking popcorn for the 2-hour cinema-ass ending they're about to throw at you. Fuck, they might just be 2 hours of cutscenes before the final boss fight that reveals everything about everything. What I'm trying to say is, Final Fantasy VII ReThird is going to be a huge-ass game, and it's going to take a while to make. I think that there's some truth to the fact that many of the assets are complete, so maybe it won't take 5 years, but there's still so much more left to do. So I would say it's going to take about 4 years to complete, if I'm being honest. So my prediction since the beginning has been early 2028 release, and I'm going to stick to that unless proven otherwise. And so people hopeful for a Game Awards reveal, bro, this happens every year, I feel. Let me tell you all the truth. It's gonna hurt a little. Are you ready? Square Enix has never done a world premiere of a big AAA game at the Game Awards ever. They've put out trailers of big titles that were previously announced, but they've never unveiled a new game at the Game Awards. In fact, I don't think they've ever done a big game reveal at any of the shows that Jeff Keighley hosts. The games they reveal at his shows are games like Killer Inn. You know, the game you forgot that they even announced at the Summer Game Fest. Look, there's a first time for everything, but it probably won't be revealed at the Game Awards this year, and neither will Kingdom Hearts 4, or Final Fantasy IX Remake, or any other of Square's big titles. I also don't think they'll reveal ReThird next year either. I suspect they'll reveal it pretty much the same way they did for Rebirth. History likes to repeat itself, doesn't it? Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was first revealed as part of Final Fantasy VII's 25th anniversary. My guess is they'll reveal Final Fantasy VII ReThird right at the beginning of 2027 as part of Final Fantasy VII's 30th anniversary, which would be convenient given January 31st was the initial release date of Final Fantasy VII, and in Japan, it's also a commemorative holiday known as Final Fantasy VII Day. So sometime around then is when I expect a big reveal of the next title. And then they'll continue to market the game leading up to its release, likely at the beginning of 2028 sometime. For now, they're focusing on Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade coming out on new platforms early next year, so I doubt there would be any kind of reveal of ReThird before then. And then the next thing that they'll focus on after that is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on Switch 2 and Xbox Series XS, which will likely release sometime in 2027, possibly in January as well, and potentially alongside the reveal of ReThird. And mind you, an early 2027 reveal of the game isn't as far away as it may seem. We're already almost at the end of 2025, so that's really only a year and a few months away if I'm correct about this. But by the time it comes out, it's possible that the PlayStation 6 could be on the horizon, so it's possible it could be a cross-generational game. Now, I'm not going to spend all the time in the world going over the PlayStation 6 leaks, but if they're correct, then there's supposed to be three options. A low tier like Xbox Series S console, a handheld like a Switch that matches the specs of the S console, and then a more powerful console that is supposed to be the most expensive. The lower tier specs for the S model and handheld is reportedly about twice as powerful as the PlayStation 5. Now, that sounds like a lot on paper, but if you understand the leaps we're used to seeing in the console space, that's actually nothing really. To put it into perspective, that's about the same leap as going from a GameCube to a Wii, and most developers are likely going to develop for the lowest common denominator and then scale up with the more powerful model. So even if the PlayStation 6 releases by the time Final Fantasy VII ReThird comes out, the game should be able to run easily on both the PlayStation 5 and 6 since they won't be too far apart in terms of computational performance. So we still need to wait just a couple more years for Final Fantasy VII ReThird, but what's next for Hamaguchi after this massive trilogy is over? If I had all the time and money in the world, Final Fantasy VI is my favorite mainline title. That would be very cool to take on as a remake. That being said, I've put my heart and soul into the Final Fantasy VII Remake series for over a decade now. Working on something completely new would be quite fun as well. So maybe he'll work on a Final Fantasy VI Remake next, or maybe the next mainline Final Fantasy title. In fact, there's a possibility he's already working on Final Fantasy XVII. Listen to this. At the studio, I have a wide range of responsibilities. I'm currently producing several game titles, some of which are not released or announced yet. I also handle game direction for series like Final Fantasy VII, which we are discussing today. He's producing several titles? So it's possible that Creative Studio 1 is already working on Final Fantasy XVII. It's also possible that these are all smaller projects, like maybe they're actually working on remastering Dirge of Cerberus. He also could be working on a totally new IP altogether. What do you guys think he's already working on? And what would you guys want Hamaguchi's next project after Final Fantasy VII ReThird to be? Do you want to see him tackle Final Fantasy VI Remake? Curious to know your thoughts. Well, in the meantime, while you're waiting for the next installment of Final Fantasy VII, you should check out my video where I express my thoughts on how the Highwind might work in Final Fantasy VII ReThird in this video right here.